I've heard of haunted places, but what happened that night? There's no explanation for it. Alone, surrounded by the howling wind and with my truck rocking as if it were about to turn over, I started hearing voices. It was just my imagination? I thought so too, until I felt something cold and invisible touching my head. And then trying to open the cabin door. This was just the beginning. If you want to know how this story ends, I suggest you stay until the end, because the worst was yet to come. Life on the road always had its ups and downs, but nothing prepared me for that night in Texas. I've been a trucker for over 2 decades and I've seen my share of strange things. But what happened on that property near an old Native American cemetery goes beyond any rational explanation. It was autumn, and Hurricane Ike had left a trail of destruction everywhere. I was hired to clean up an area filled with sawdust and debris. The work was tough, but paying the bills was more important than any superstition about cursed lands. I spent 2 weeks in that desolate place with some companions. As the job was coming to an end, I ended up staying alone with a colleague. With no other place to go, we slept in our trucks, parked on that isolated property. My old 1995 low-roof Freightliner was my temporary home. The narrow bed wasn't the epitome of comfort, but it had already sheltered me on countless lonely nights on the road. Little did I know that this particular night would become one of the scariest of my life. The biting cold and the snowflakes falling outside made me retreat early. Around 8 p.m., I lay down with my head near the window, wrapped in blankets, trying to ignore the howling wind that made the truck rock. Little did I know that this night would turn into one of the scariest trucker stories I've ever experienced. The wind picked up intensity, howling like a wounded animal. My truck rocked violently, as if an invisible force were trying to turn it over. Amidst the chaos, I heard something that sent shivers down my spine. Voices. Muffled. Almost inaudible voices, but unmistakable. Who the hell is making noise at this time? I thought aloud, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. After all, it was just me and my colleague in that godforsaken place. The voices persisted, mixing with the howling wind, creating a macabre symphony that made my heart race. Suddenly, I felt something that defied all logic, an ethereal cold sensation, as if a hand had reached through the small ventilation window and touched my head. Panic took over me. I threw my elbow back, trying to ward off that invisible presence. For a moment, the touch ceased, but the relief was short-lived. The wind intensified even more, and then I heard something that froze me in place. Someone, or something, was trying to open the door of my truck. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The door was locked, but that seemed insignificant compared to the terror that was unfolding. Inside the cabin, chaos ensued. The wind, in some impossible way, seemed to have invaded the interior of the truck. There was a deafening noise of plastics being torn, as if an invisible whirlwind were destroying everything around me. In the midst of panic, I could only stammer, "Lord, what's happening?" Little did I know that this night would become one of the scariest trucker ghost stories ever told. Terror reached its peak when I felt an overwhelming pressure on my body. It was as if an invisible force were trying to immobilize me on the narrow bed of the truck. Panic took over, and my mind screamed in despair. I tried to call for help, but my tongue felt heavy as lead, refusing to form words. In my desperation, I turned to the faith that had always accompanied me on long, solitary journeys. With all the strength I could muster, I cried out in my thoughts, "Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth, have mercy. The blood of Jesus is upon you." I repeated these words like a mantra, an anchor in the supernatural storm that engulfed me. Slowly, I felt the pressure lessen. It was as if that malevolent presence had retreated, overcome by a greater force. The curtains of the truck were violently pulled back, and I heard a sharp sound, like a blade slicing through the air. In an instant, it was all over, leaving only the deafening silence of the night. With trembling hands, I turned on the cabin lights. My eyes frantically scanned every corner, searching for any tangible sign of that terrifying encounter. There was nothing but the disorder caused by the inexplicable indoor gust. With my heart still racing, I grabbed my Bible and started reading aloud. seeking comfort in the sacred words. The night dragged on slowly, and I remained vigilant, fearful that the malevolent presence might return. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the darkness, I felt an indescribable relief. That's when my colleague, who slept in the truck next to mine, appeared with a confused expression. To my surprise, he hadn't heard a thing during the night, except for the sound of the wind. That experience, one of the most chilling trucker stories I've ever lived, seemed to be mine alone. The rising sun brought a sense of relief, but also deep unease, as I surveyed the desolate landscape around me, marked by the debris left by Hurricane Ike. I tried to process the events of the previous night. My colleague looked at me with concern, clearly disturbed by my haggard appearance and the chaotic state of the inside of my truck. "You okay, partner?" he asked, furrowing his brow. "Looks like you've been through a war in here." I hesitated for a moment, pondering whether to share my experience. After all, scary trucker stories were common on the roads, but what I had experienced went beyond any tale I'd ever heard. I decided to be honest, even if it meant sounding crazy. "Something strange happened last night," I began, my voice still trembling. "Something I can't explain." As I recounted the events, I noticed my colleague's expression change from concern to disbelief. He listened silently, occasionally glancing at the nearby Native American cemetery. "Look," he said finally, "I've heard a lot of trucker ghost stories, but this is different." We spent the morning straightening up the inside of my truck, trying to restore some order. Every misplaced object, every tear in the plastics, was a vivid reminder of the terror I had faced. The manual labor helped calm my nerves, but I couldn't help notice how anxious my colleague seemed to be to leave. When we finally finished the job and prepared to depart from that haunted place, I paused for one last reflection. The experiences of that night would forever be etched in my memory, one of the inexplicable trucker stories that defy logic and reason. As I started the engine of my Freightliner, I made a silent promise to myself. Never again would I accept jobs in places with shadowy reputations, no matter how tempting the offer. Some roads, I learned, are better left untraveled. With one last glance at the property that now seemed strangely peaceful in the daylight, I drove off. The familiar rumble of the engine brought a sense of normalcy, a reminder that life went on. But I knew that from that moment on, every shadow on the road, every strange noise in the night, would carry the echo of that terrifying experience. As the Native American cemetery faded in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but think of how many other truckers, on how many other lonely roads, would have their own horror stories to tell. The road, I realized, keeps its secrets, and some of them are better left untold. Have you ever been alone on the road, in the middle of nowhere, and felt like something was watching you? On that night, in 1975, I was alone, crossing the Wyoming desert, when I saw a light in the sky that shouldn't have been there. Minutes later, the radio exploded with static, and a fellow trucker's rig disappeared off the map. But the worst part, I saw what took him. And I'll tell you, it wasn't from this world. If you think you've heard all the trucker stories, I assure you, this one will make you question everything. But be warned, don't look up. The highway stretched before me like a black ribbon cutting through the Wyoming desert. It was a cold autumn night in 1975, and I, a trucker for international transport, was on my usual route from Idaho Falls to Casper. The rumble of my Peterbilt 359's engine was my only company in that vast, desolate expanse. My name doesn't matter, but my story does. I'm a simple man, with calloused hands and tired eyes from staring at the horizon for too long. On that night, like so many others, I was hauling a load of lumber, the fresh scent of pine still lingering in the air around me. The CB radio crackled occasionally, bringing distant voices of other truckers sharing scary trucker stories. Tales of trucker ghosts were common on these long nights, but I always dismissed them as nonsense. After all, the road was scary enough without having to make up monsters. It was past 2 a.m. when I noticed something strange. The lights on my truck's dashboard started flickering erratically. I thought it was just an electrical malfunction. But then I saw something that made me question my sanity. A bright light appeared in the sky, moving in a way that no aircraft I knew could match. I tried to convince myself that it was just a meteor, part of the meteor shower lighting up the sky that night. But as the light drew closer, I felt a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. That's when the CB radio came alive with a frantic voice. "Anyone seeing me? There's something following me." The voice on the radio belonged to Jake, a fellow trucker who was a few miles ahead of me. The panic in his voice was palpable, sending shivers down my spine. I grabbed the microphone, responding with all the calm I could muster. "Jake, this is Bill. I hear you. What's going on?" My eyes frantically scanned the road ahead, searching for Jake's taillights. "Bill, there are some lights. They're everywhere. They're not normal headlights. They're dancing in the sky." Jake's voice was trembling, almost hysterical. I could hear the sheer terror in every word. I tried to rationalize, thinking maybe they were just reflections of the northern lights dancing in the sky that night. But something in Jake's tone told me it was more than that. The scary trucker stories I had always dismissed started to take on a new meaning at that moment. Suddenly, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. About 2 kilometers ahead, a bright light illuminated the sky for a brief moment, like slow-motion lightning. When it disappeared, I realized I could no longer see Jake's taillights. Jake, can you hear me?" I shouted into the radio, but all I heard was static in response. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the roar of my own engine and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I stepped on the accelerator, ignoring all speed limits. The darkness of the night seemed to swallow everything in front of me, and every shadow on the road came alive in my overactive imagination. The chilling trucker stories I had heard over the years echoed in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. When I finally reached the spot where I had seen the light, there was no sign of Jake's truck. The road was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. I pulled over to the side, stepping out of the cabin with a trembling hand. The night air was heavy, carrying a strange smell that I couldn't identify. It wasn't burnt oil or rubber. It was something different, something that didn't belong on that lonely road in the middle of nowhere. As I walked along the roadside, my flashlight illuminated something on the asphalt. I moved closer, my heart nearly stopping when I saw what it was. Tire marks, deep and smoking, as if Jake's truck had been pulled off the road by an unimaginable force. The smell of burnt rubber filled my nostrils as I examined the marks on the asphalt. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe Jake had lost control and veered off the road, but where was the truck? Suddenly, I heard a sound, a low, prolonged moan that seemed to come from all directions at once. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, illuminating only the infinite darkness of the Wyoming desert. "Jake?" I called out, my voice echoing in the night. There was no response, just that constant, unsettling moan. I started walking along the road, following the tire marks. They led me off the asphalt and onto the rough terrain beside it. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jake's truck was there, about 100 meters from the road, but it wasn't standing upright. It was lying on its side, as if a giant hand had knocked it over like a toy. The lights were still flickering faintly, casting strange shadows on the desolate landscape. I ran towards the vehicle, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. When I reached it, I saw that the cabin was empty. The driver's door was open, swaying gently in the night breeze. "Jake!" I shouted again, my voice breaking with growing panic. "Where are you, man?" That's when I noticed something strange on the side of the truck. I brought my flashlight closer and saw marks. They weren't just scratches from an accident. They looked like claw marks, huge and deep, tearing through the metal as if it were paper. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank, right? But deep down I knew it wasn't. The trucker ghost stories I had always dismissed as fiction suddenly seemed terrifyingly real. A movement in the corner of my eye made me spin around quickly. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a tall, dark figure moving in the darkness. But when I pointed my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. The moaning that I had heard earlier grew louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I started to back away slowly towards my own truck, my eyes frantically searching the darkness. That's when I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. On the ground, illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight, was Jake's cap. That old faded cap he always wore, with the company logo worn out by time. It lay on the ground as if it had been deliberately left there. My trembling hand reached down to pick it up. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The ground around the cap was different. The earth seemed to have been burned, forming a perfect circular pattern. And in the center of that circle, where the cap lay, the earth glistened with a strange metallic sheen I had never seen before. The moaning that had been echoing through the night suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so profound that it was almost deafening. It was in that moment of absolute stillness that I heard something that made my heart nearly stop. "Bill." The voice was weak, barely a whisper, but unmistakably Jake's. I spun around, searching frantically for the source of the sound. "Jake, where are you?" "Bill, don't look up." Those words made my blood run cold. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep my eyes on the ground, to run back to my truck and drive away as fast as I could. But something stronger compelled me to lift my head. What I saw in that moment will forever be etched in my memory. Hovering silently in the sky right above me was something that defied all logic and reason. It wasn't an airplane, nor a helicopter, nor anything I could explain. It was a dark mass, larger than any vehicle I had ever seen, with pulsating lights that seemed hypnotic. And there, suspended in the air below that thing, was Jake. He seemed to be floating, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. In that instant, all the scary trucker stories, all the inexplicable trucker tales I had ever heard, seemed to converge into this single moment of indescribable horror. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I ran like I had never run before, stumbling and staggering over the uneven ground back towards my truck. The sound of my heart pounding was deafening in my ears, drowning out any other noise. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the door. I started the engine and floored the accelerator, the wheels spinning in the loose dirt before finding traction. As I sped away into the dark night, my eyes kept returning to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following me. But all I saw was the darkness of the night, swallowing the scene I had just witnessed. I drove non-stop until dawn, my mind replaying the events of the night in an endless loop. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I realized I was still holding Jake's cap so tightly that my fingers had gone numb. I never saw Jake again after that night. I never knew what really happened to him, but one thing I know for sure: there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that turn trucker ghost stories into pale shadows of reality. And sometimes, on those dark and lonely nights on the road, when the silence is broken only by the rumble of the engine, I still hear that distant moan, a somber reminder that there are mysteries better left unsolved. I've been a trucker for over 15 years, and I can say with certainty that I've seen my fair share of strange things on the roads, but nothing compares to what happened on that autumn night when I was making a routine delivery to Charlotte, North Carolina. The air was crisp, with a hint of humidity signaling the approaching winter. My name doesn't matter, but what I'm about to tell you will stay with you for a long time. This is one of those scary trucker stories that circulated gas stations and rest stops. But I can assure you that every word is true. I know, because I lived every second of that nightmare. It was almost 11 at night when I entered the I-77 near the junction with the I-85. Traffic was surprisingly calm for a weekday, and I was grateful for it. My eyes were burning from exhaustion after countless hours behind the wheel, but I knew I was close to my destination. That's when I saw him for the first time. On the side of the road, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees, stood a man, or at least, that's what it seemed at first glance. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange about his appearance. He was completely black, not just his skin, but his entire being. It was as if he were a three-dimensional silhouette, with no discernible features beyond his humanoid shape. A chill ran down my spine as I drove past him. My years of experience on the road had taught me to trust my instincts, and in that moment, every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong, very wrong. This was the beginning of one of the most chilling trucker stories I've ever heard, or rather, lived. I tried to push the image of that shadowy figure out of my mind, focusing on the road ahead. After all, I'd seen my fair share of strange things in all these years as a trucker, but something about that apparition bothered me deeply, as if it had touched some primal instinct within me. I kept driving, my truck's headlights slicing through the darkness of the night. The radio crackled softly, playing a barely audible country song. Suddenly, I noticed something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. A dark shape was moving swiftly along the roadside, keeping pace with the truck. I blinked several times, certain that my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure persisted, moving at an impossible speed for a human being. It was him, the same black silhouette I had seen before, now following me along the highway. My heart raced. I stepped on the accelerator, exceeding the speed limit, but the dark figure continued to keep up without apparent effort. Sweat dripped down my forehead as I maneuvered the heavy vehicle, struggling to maintain control while trying to escape that menacing presence. It was at that moment that I realized this wasn't just one of those trucker horror stories that we often share at rest stops. This was real, it was happening to me, and I had no idea how to escape. The night that started as a routine delivery was quickly turning into one of the scariest trucker stories. The truck's dashboard indicated that I was dangerously above the speed limit, but fear kept me from slowing down. My eyes darted back and forth between the road ahead and the rearview mirrors, where that shadowy figure relentlessly pursued me. Suddenly, the lights on the dashboard started flickering and the truck's engine stalled. "No, no, no," I shouted, pounding the steering wheel in desperation. The vehicle gradually lost speed until it came to a halt on the shoulder. I froze, my fingers still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. With my heart hammering in my chest, I saw through the side mirror the black figure slowly approaching the truck. This wasn't just one of those chilling trucker stories. I was living a real nightmare. The being stopped next to the driver's door, its obscure form filling the window. In a burst of courage, or perhaps sheer terror, he flung the door open, expecting to hit the creature. But the door passed right through it as if it were made of smoke. Before I could react, I felt an intense cold envelop my body, as if I were being sucked into an icy abyss. In that moment, flashes of memory invaded my mind. I recalled stories of haunted truckers I had heard over the years, accounts of inexplicable encounters on lonely roads. I realized that I was now part of those stories, but unlike the others, I was experiencing this terror firsthand. The intense cold that enveloped me lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it finally passed, I opened my eyes, expecting to find myself in some strange place, or perhaps not wake up at all. To my surprise, I was still in the truck, exactly where it had stopped. I frantically looked around, searching for the shadowy figure, but there was no sign of it. The truck's engine roared back to life on its own. As if nothing had happened, confused and still trembling, I decided to continue my journey, eager to reach my destination and leave this experience behind. When I finally arrived at the delivery location in Charlotte, dawn was breaking. As I unloaded the cargo, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Was it real? Had it been just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Doubts consumed me. That's when I noticed something strange in my reflection on the polished side of the truck. For a brief moment, I saw a dark shadow next to me, as if it were a part of me. I blinked rapidly, and the image disappeared, but the chill I felt was very real. I realized at that instant that my experience wasn't just another one of those eerie trucker stories. It was something deeper, more personal. That shadowy entity, whatever it was, had left its mark on me, and I knew that from then on, every time I hit the road, I would carry with me not just my cargo but also the weight of this inexplicable encounter. The roads would never be the same for me, and I had become part of the supernatural trucker stories that I had tried so hard not to believe in over the years. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.